The letter arrived in an unassuming white envelope, just like any other. No special markings, no dramatic seals. Just my name typed neatly on the front, Daniel Whitaker. I remember standing in my tiny office above the antique shop, dust still on my hands from a 19th century rocking chair I'd been restoring. I almost didn't open it right away. But when I did, everything changed. The words weren't dramatic either, just cold, clinical, the kind of language lawyers love to use when they're gutting you without leaving a scar. It simply said that my father, Robert Whitaker, had revised his will. I had been removed as a beneficiary, entirely. No partial inheritance, no family home, no trust fund. Nothing. My name might as well have been erased from the family record. I stood there, clutching that letter like it might dissolve in my fingers. For a long moment, I didn't even feel anger, just this hollow silence in my chest. I wasn't shocked exactly. Disappointed? Yes. Hurt? More than I thought possible. But shocked? Not really. My father never hid his disdain for what he called my hobby. Antique restoration wasn't a real business to him. It wasn't the cutthroat, suit and tie empire he had spent his life building. He used to say, "You waste your time with dead wood and forgotten things, Daniel." I used to laugh it off, tell myself it didn't matter what he thought. But it did. It always had. Growing up in the Whitaker house meant one thing: follow the plan. My older brother Nathan had been groomed for the CEO role since he was 12. My sister Caroline took the legal route, becoming the company's in-house counsel before she even hit 30. And me? I was the quiet one, the kid who spent hours in the attic, brushing off old picture frames, obsessing over antique books, studying the handwriting of long-dead relatives in dusty journals. My father once caught me reading a letter from my great-grandfather, a beautifully penned note describing the first piece of land our family ever bought. He sneered at it, scoffed even. "History doesn't pay the bills," he said. "It's the present that matters." But my grandfather, his father, had always been different. He never said much, but when he did, it mattered. I remember once, when I was 17, I showed him a Victorian-era cabinet I'd restored. I was so nervous. I thought he'd dismiss it like my dad always did. Instead, he ran his fingers along the edge, smiled, and said, "You've got patience. That's rarer than you think." That one sentence carried me through years of silence. So when I got that letter and the weight of being cut off, legally, emotionally, symbolically, settled on my shoulders, I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I just sat there, looking out the window at the street below, watching people pass by, unaware that my world had just quietly collapsed. I didn't tell anyone for a week. Not my girlfriend at the time, not my friends, not even my mother, who I suspected had no idea what Robert had done. But then the funeral came. My grandfather passed away 2 months after the will fiasco. He had been declining for a while, and though it wasn't unexpected, it still hit hard. He was the last person in my family who looked at me like I belonged. The funeral was everything my father loved: elegant, polished, emotionless. My grandfather had been cremated, his ashes placed in a custom-made urn shaped like a globe, a tribute to his travels. My father made a speech about legacy and endurance. Caroline cried softly. Nathan checked his watch. I stayed in the back, away from the spotlight, watching it all play out like a script I hadn't been invited to read. After the service, a man approached me, older, maybe late 60s, kind face, soft hands. He introduced himself as Mr. Llewellyn, my grandfather's lawyer. He handed me a small, leather-bound box and said, "He wanted you to have this privately. Said you'd know what to do with it." I held the box like it was made of glass. I didn't open it right away. Not in front of anyone. Later that night, I sat in my apartment, no champagne, no toast to the departed. Just me and the box. When I finally undid the brass latch, my hands were shaking. Inside were a stack of aged papers tied with twine, a journal with my grandfather's name embossed in fading gold, and a folded letter addressed to me. It was his handwriting. I knew it instantly. Slanted, neat, and deliberate. The letter was short but powerful. He wrote about legacy, not the kind measured in money or boardroom dominance, but the kind found in stories, memories, choices. He told me he had always admired my heart, my vision, and that I reminded him of who he was before the world hardened him. And then came the part that stopped my breath. These documents, they are the origin of it all. Before your father turned the company into what it is today, this was the dream. These pages are worth more than gold, but I know you won't sell them. You'll protect them, restore them, tell our real story. And right there, in that moment, something shifted inside me. My father may have cut me off from his empire, but my grandfather, he had given me the kingdom's soul. I didn't know exactly what I would do with it yet, but I knew one thing for certain. This legacy wasn't over, not by a long shot. I didn't sleep the night I found out. I sat in my workshop surrounded by tools and half-finished projects, my grandfather's box sitting silently on the workbench in front of me. It wasn't just a box. It was a message, a quiet, dignified whisper from a man who had never raised his voice, but had carried the weight of generations. I opened it again, slowly this time, as if afraid the contents might vanish. There were faded ledgers, brittle with age, ink barely holding onto yellowed paper, handwritten contracts in looping cursive, letters written to suppliers and partners, and tucked at the very bottom, a leather-bound journal with initials etched in gold. My grandfather's personal journal. I ran my fingers over the cover, the same way I'd touch a fragile carving. Inside were pages filled with thoughts, ideas, fears, not just about business, but about family, duty, legacy. One entry hit me like a gut punch. Robert is a builder of empires, but he forgets that empires fall when you forget your people. I see in Daniel something gentler, quieter, yes, but stronger in a way Robert cannot understand. That was me, Daniel, the quiet one, the one who restored, not built, the one who remembered, not reinvented. For the first time in years, I felt seen, not for who I tried to be, but for who I actually was. That journal became my Bible. I read every page. I mapped out the early roots of the company, the desperate post-war deals, the failed ventures that never made it into my father's version of history, the moral decisions my grandfather had wrestled with, the partners he had to let go because they prioritized greed over integrity, the deals he walked away from, the values he tried, and failed to pass down to my father. It painted a very different picture of the business, a human one. My father had always framed it as triumph, victory, efficiency. But my grandfather had documented the cost, the betrayals, the heartbreaks, and in those pages, I began to see what I had always suspected but never dared admit. The version of the business my father built wasn't the legacy, it was the deviation. I kept reading late into the mornings, tracing the thread of history my father had tried to erase. The more I read, the more I understood why my grandfather left this to me and not to my father or my siblings. They wouldn't have seen it for what it was. They would have locked it away, or worse, thrown it out. I knew I couldn't keep this to myself, but I also knew I wasn't going to run to the press or post some vindictive takedown online. This was still my family. As broken and divided as we were, these were still my blood ties. But I had to do something. I had to honor what my grandfather saw in me. I had to reclaim that legacy, not for revenge, but for truth. So I made a plan. It started simply. I began cataloging the documents, digitizing them carefully, cross-referencing dates and deals, creating a timeline of the early years of the company. I reached out to a few historians I trusted, people who understood business history, people I had worked with on antique restorations before. Quietly, I started building an archive, not for publication, but for preservation. It was slow, meticulous work, but it felt right. And then, one day, I received an invitation. A gala. The 60th anniversary of the company. Hosted by my father, of course. Black tie, big-name donors, the whole thing dripping in polished prestige. I wasn't supposed to be invited. I knew that. so I was surprised to see my name on the list. But as I scanned the bottom of the invitation, I noticed the handwriting. It wasn't my father's, it was my mother's. She had written it in, a quiet act of rebellion from a woman who had spent her entire life in his shadow. I almost didn't go. The thought of walking into that room, surrounded by people who saw me as a disappointment, or worse, irrelevant, made my stomach churn. But then I thought of my grandfather, of that journal, of the stories that had never been told. And I realized I had to go, not to make a scene, not to take back anything, but to let them know I hadn't disappeared. I was still here. The night of the gala, I wore the same dark navy suit I'd restored from the 1950s. My grandfather's cufflinks. Nothing flashy, just history, quietly wrapped around my wrist. When I walked into the ballroom, I could feel the eyes. A few guests recognized me. Most didn't. My siblings stiffened when they saw me. My father didn't even turn. He was too busy laughing with a tech CEO. But my mother gave me a nod. Small, discreet, enough to say, I see you. Then something unexpected happened. One of the senior partners, a man who had known my grandfather, approached me. He looked at my cufflinks, then at me. "Edwards?" he asked. I nodded. He smiled. "He would have liked what you've become." That simple sentence caught me off guard. I hadn't realized how badly I needed to hear something like that someone else saw it too. But just as I was finding my footing, my father finally turned. And the look on his face? Cold, calculated. He walked straight toward me, glass of scotch in hand, and with a sharp smile said the words I'll never forget. "Well, well, the prodigal son returns. What brings you here? Looking for a handout?" I didn't flinch. I smiled back. "Actually, Dad, I'm here to return something." He raised an eyebrow, but before he could speak again, I reached into my inner pocket and pulled out a thin, folded page. A copy of the very first contract my grandfather had signed, one my father had never acknowledged in the company's official history. I placed it on the table between us and simply said, "You left me out of the will, but you forgot something." I still hold the origin story. His face changed, and in that instant, I knew I had his attention. But what I didn't know is just how far he would go to make sure that attention didn't turn into exposure. He didn't say a word. Not at first. He just stared at the document. That signature, Edward Harlow, clear as day with the original terms of the partnership that had launched our family's fortune. It wasn't worth anything on paper now, but symbolically, it was everything. Proof that the company didn't start with my father's genius, but with my grandfather's values. He finally looked up at me, and something in his eyes had shifted. The smug confidence was still there, but now it had edges, sharp ones. I knew that look. I'd seen it before, usually directed at competitors, sometimes even employees. I just never thought I'd be on the receiving end of it. "You've been digging," he said quietly, voice low enough that only I could hear. "And you think, what? That you've got leverage?" I held his gaze. "No, I've got clarity." He smirked, but there was tension in his jaw. "You don't understand what this business takes, what I had to sacrifice to keep it afloat. Your grandfather, he was a dreamer, too soft. I had to clean up his messes." I took a breath, steadying myself. "No, you erased them. You rewrote the story to make yourself the hero. But those messes, they were human. He made mistakes, sure, but he owned them. You? You just paved over them with PR and spreadsheets." His smile faded entirely now. "If you think a few yellowed pages and a romanticized journal mean anything to the board, you're even more naive than I thought." I leaned in slightly, voice calm. "I'm not trying to impress the board. I'm not even here to fight for a seat. I'm here to remember the man who built something with integrity before you turned it into a monument to your ego." He didn't respond. Not with words. But his silence said enough. I'd struck a nerve, and in that moment, something between us broke for good. There was no going back. Later that night, as the party buzzed around us, I saw him whispering to one of the legal advisors. I saw heads turning toward me. Glances, murmurs. That's when I knew this wasn't over. The next morning it started. First came the email from the family trust lawyer, cold, formal, full of legalese. A reminder that I was officially disinherited and that any continued public referencing of internal family matters could be grounds for a defamation suit. Then came the call from a restoration client. A polite cancellation, no explanation. Then another, and another. My name was being quietly blacklisted. My father wasn't coming after me with noise. He was doing it the way he always did: clean, efficient, quiet, erasure. But I was ready. Because I'd been quiet my whole life. I knew how to work in silence. And this time, I had the truth on my side. I called one of the historians I've been working with. It's time, I said. Within days, we launched a private digital archive, invitation only. No social media fanfare, no flashy announcement, just a password-protected library of documents, images, letters, and scans, all sourced from my grandfather's box, organized into a clean chronological narrative. The Forgotten Foundation, the real story of Harlow and Company. We didn't name names. We didn't accuse. We just showed. The truth didn't need a lawyer. It needed a spotlight. And slowly, the word began to spread. Among academics, archivists, former employees, whispers turned to conversations. People who had once worked for the company began emailing us, some with old letters, some with stories, some with quiet thank yous. But I wasn't prepared for the message that hit my inbox late one night. A scanned document, an unsigned letter from someone inside the company. Subject line: "He's hiding more than you think." The letter was brief. No salutation, no date, just a few lines that were more a warning than a confession. And the archives are just the beginning. There's more, much more. But be careful what you dig up. Some things can't be undone. I stared at the message for a long time, my finger hovering over the mouse. I wasn't sure what to make of it. Was it a threat? A hidden confession? Whoever sent it clearly knew something. Something I hadn't uncovered yet. And they were urging me to stop. But why? The uncertainty gnawed at me. But I couldn't back down. Not now. I spent the next few days tracking down the sender, but there were no clear leads. The email was from a burner account, untraceable. But the message stuck with me. Be careful what you dig up. That wasn't just a warning. It was personal. Whoever had written it seemed to know more than I did. Much more. It wasn't until the next morning that I got a call from one of the old archivists I had contacted for help. Her voice, usually steady, was filled with urgency. "I think I found something," she said. "It's about your father." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. "What did you find?" "I don't know if I should be telling you this. It's not in the archives, not anywhere public, but there's a record. A letter your grandfather wrote. Not just about the company, about your father." My heart pounded in my chest. This was it. This was the key to everything. I rushed to her office that afternoon. As I stepped through the door, she handed me a thick, yellowed envelope, one that looked like it had been tucked away for decades. Inside was a single crumpled letter. It was dated nearly 40 years ago. My grandfather's handwriting was elegant, precise. I unfolded it carefully, my fingers trembling. "To my dear Robert, I know you will not agree with my decision, but you must understand that what I am about to do is not for you, but for the future of this company. You have become obsessed with profits, with expansion, with growth, but you've lost sight of what made us strong in the first place. You have lost your way, Robert, and I fear that the decisions you are making now will harm more than help. I am placing the company in the hands of someone who understands its true value. Someone who understands the sacrifice and heart that went into it. Someone who believes in the legacy more than the bottom line. Your father has been offered the chairmanship, but you, my dear son, are no longer in my will. I wish you would listen, but I can no longer stand by and watch you destroy what we built. With love, Your father. That was the moment I realized the full scope of what had happened. My grandfather hadn't just left me a legacy, he had left me a warning. It wasn't just my father's disinheritance of me that had caused the rift. It was his influence over the company, his insatiable thirst for more that had alienated him from the very values that had once built their empire. And that letter, written all these years ago, proved that the damage had already been done. My grandfather had fought to keep him from taking over the family business, but Robert had succeeded anyway, using whatever means necessary. My grandfather had been afraid of what Robert would become, and from what I had seen over the years, those fears had come true. I folded the letter, my mind racing. The anger, the frustration, the betrayal, it was all coming into sharp focus. It wasn't just about me. It wasn't about the inheritance. This wasn't just a family feud over money or assets. This was about a battle for the soul of the family's legacy, a legacy that had already been poisoned long ago. The pain in my chest felt unbearable. For so long, I had blamed myself for not fitting into my father's world, for not carrying on the legacy the way he had wanted me to. But now, with the weight of my grandfather's words pressing down on me, I understood. The legacy wasn't just something to be preserved, it was something that had to be protected. And my father, in his quest for more, had lost sight of that entirely. I needed to figure out what to do next. As I was leaving the office, I received another call. This time, it was a journalist. She identified herself as a reporter for a well-known financial magazine. "I've been digging," she said, her voice low, "and I think you'll want to know something. About your father." My heart skipped a beat. "Tell me," I said, barely able to control my voice. "There's a deal, a secret merger that your father arranged. It was kept under wraps, but it's about to go public. And it could ruin him." I felt my stomach drop. "Ruin him?" I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean?" "There's been talk for years about shady deals, about money laundering, even illegal practices. But this merger, it could blow the whole thing wide open." I had no idea what to think. Was this the breakthrough I'd been waiting for? Or was it just another piece of the puzzle that would drag us all deeper into this family's legacy of deception? But then the reporter dropped another bombshell. "I think it's tied to your grandfather's will, and I think you're the key to unlocking the truth." I felt a chill run through me. My grandfather's will? The reporter's words echoed in my mind. I had been so focused on uncovering the truth about my father, about the family business, that I hadn't considered the possibility that my grandfather had left more behind than just the company's records. "Are you saying my grandfather knew about this merger?" I asked, struggling to process the information. "I'm saying he knew a lot more than you think," the reporter replied. "And I'm certain that he left clues, something hidden in his old documents that could unravel everything. If you're willing to dig deeper, I can help you find it. But you have to be prepared for what it might reveal." I didn't need her to tell me that. I could already feel the weight of the situation pressing on me, like an anchor dragging me down. But I was already too far in to back out now. If there was any chance of exposing the truth, of bringing my father's corruption into the light, I couldn't ignore it. "I'll do it," I said, my voice steady but laced with determination. "Where do we start?" She gave me a name, a contact who had worked closely with my grandfather in the final years of his life, someone who might know more about the secrets my grandfather had left behind. This person was old, but they might have crucial information. And though the lead was vague, I couldn't afford to let it slip away. That evening, I made my way to the small town where my grandfather had spent his final years. I didn't know exactly what I was hoping to find, but something inside told me that whatever secrets were hidden there, they were the final pieces of the puzzle. I arrived at the address, a nondescript house on the outskirts of town. The lights were dim, and the air felt thick with the weight of the past. I knocked on the door, my heart thumping in my chest, but there was no answer. I knocked again, a little louder this time, and then I heard movement inside. A frail old woman opened the door. Her face was weathered with age, but her eyes were sharp, and there was something almost knowing in her gaze. "You're Robert's son, aren't you?" she asked, her voice hoarse but firm. I nodded. "Yes. I'm sorry to bother you, but I was hoping to speak with you about my grandfather." The woman's expression softened slightly, but there was still a wariness in her eyes. "Come in, then," she said, stepping aside to allow me in. The house was small but cozy, filled with the scent of old books and the faint crackle of a fireplace. She led me to a room at the back, where a collection of old furniture sat in quiet solitude, as if untouched by time. "Sit," she said, gesturing to a chair across from her. "I know why you're here." I took a seat, unsure of what to expect. I could feel the tension building between us, the air heavy with unspoken words. "I've heard rumors," she began, looking directly at me, "about the things your father did after your grandfather passed, the deals, the people he betrayed. But I don't know how much of it is true. Your grandfather didn't talk much about those days. Did he leave anything for me, any clue about what I should do?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm, though the anxiety gnawed at my insides. The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked away, her gaze distant. For a moment, I thought she wasn't going to speak, but then she let out a long sigh, as if weighing the gravity of what she was about to reveal. "I'll tell you what I know," she said slowly, "but you need to understand. Digging into this family's past comes with consequences. If you really want to know the truth, you'll have to accept whatever it is, no matter how dark." I nodded. "I'm ready." She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Your grandfather didn't just leave behind business records. He left something far more important. But it's hidden. He trusted only a few people, and the rest of us were sworn to silence. But there's a place where he kept things, things that would ruin Robert if anyone ever found them." "Where is it?" I asked, my pulse quickening. She gave me a grim smile. "You won't find it in the documents. It's not something that can be easily discovered. But you need to know. Your grandfather planned for this. He saw what your father was becoming and knew that someone like him would never be able to carry the true legacy forward. That's why he hid everything." "But where?" I pressed. "Where is this place?" The woman looked at me with a mixture of pity and regret. "You won't find it in the open. It's hidden away in the place where your grandfather spent the most time, the old family estate. But be warned, it won't be easy to get there, and it may not be safe." I didn't need any more warnings. I had come this far, and now there was no turning back. My father had built his empire on deceit, on manipulation. It was time to uncover everything. Time to take control of the legacy he had tried to bury. "Thank you," I said, standing up. "I'll find it. I'll make sure the truth comes out." As I left the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was heading straight into a storm. Whatever secrets my grandfather had hidden, whatever truths had been buried, they were about to come to light, and they would change everything. The drive to the old family estate was eerily silent, the landscape rolling by in a blur of autumn-colored trees and fading sunlight. The place where my grandfather had spent his final years was tucked away in the hills, miles from any major town. It had always been a symbol of stability, the house where our family had gathered for holidays, where my father had once played with his siblings, where my grandfather had patiently restored old heirlooms. But now, it felt more like a mausoleum than a home, a relic of a past I was no longer sure I understood. I parked my car at the foot of the gravel driveway, its tires crunching under the weight of decades. The house stood ahead, its tall, ivy-clad stone walls towering in the twilight. The windows were dark, but I knew the place too well. It had been years since I'd stepped foot inside, but the memories flooded back. The faint smell of wood polish, the creak of the old floorboards, the sound of my father's voice commanding the room, even as he was never truly present. This was where it all began, where my grandfather's legacy had been born, where everything had unraveled. I walked toward the front door, each step feeling heavier than the last. The house looked almost exactly the same as I remembered it, untouched by time. But I wasn't here for nostalgia. I was here for answers. Inside, the air was thick with the past. Dust had settled on the antique furniture, but everything was still in its place. The grand staircase stretched up before me, leading to the second floor where my grandfather had spent much of his time. The house was vast, with corridors that twisted like forgotten memories. I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease as I walked deeper inside, the stillness pressing against me. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Some hidden compartment, an old chest, a clue that would lead me to the treasure trove my grandfather had secreted away. But whatever it was, I knew it had to be in here. I ascended the stairs, the wood creaking beneath my feet, and made my way down the hall toward my grandfather's study. It had been his sanctuary, his place of refuge when he wasn't managing the business. When I was young, I used to sit at the desk beside him, watching as his hands moved deftly across papers, scribbling notes, making decisions that would shape the family's future. Now, as I stood before the door, a strange hesitation gripped me. The room had remained closed since my grandfather's passing. No one had dared to enter it, not even my father, whose business dealings were tied to every inch of this estate. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside, the familiar scent of aged paper filling my nose. It was just as I remembered, but everything felt heavier. The air hung thick with the weight of secrets. I began searching immediately, pulling open drawers, rifling through old ledgers, looking for any sign of the hidden truth. There were papers everywhere, business contracts, invoices, personal notes from my grandfather. Nothing stood out. But then I found it. A small, worn, leather-bound notebook buried beneath a stack of papers. My heart skipped a beat. It felt different from the rest. Something about it seemed deliberate. I pulled it out and flipped it open. The pages were filled with my grandfather's neat, looping handwriting, his thoughts on family, on business, on the world. But as I turned the pages, something caught my eye. A note written in the margin of one page, almost as though it had been added later. A cryptic message that seemed to jump off the page. When the time comes, the key will be where the past and future meet. The door opens when you remember what's been forgotten. I stared at the words for a moment, the puzzle piece clicking into place. My grandfather had been a man of mystery, a man who never spoke openly about the darker aspects of the family's history. But he had always been strategic. The note was a clue, the key to unlocking whatever secret he had hidden. I sat back in the chair, my mind racing. The past and future meet. What could that mean, and what had been forgotten? The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. My grandfather had been speaking in riddles, just as he always did when he didn't want to give a direct answer. The key wasn't something physical, it was something symbolic. The past and the future, the legacy of the family, the very foundation of the business, had always been intertwined. And it was here, in this house, in these memories, that the truth lay hidden. Suddenly, I had a flash of realization. The phrase about what's been forgotten. It wasn't just about the family's history. It was about the very foundation of the business itself. The first dealings, the sacrifices made, the choices that my father had never wanted anyone to know. I couldn't stay here forever. I needed to act. I needed to find the place where my grandfather had hidden whatever he left behind, the physical evidence of the family's true legacy. If I was right, this would be the final piece to the puzzle. I grabbed the notebook and ran my hand across the cover, feeling the slight indentation beneath my fingers. There was something inside, a piece of paper, folded tightly. My pulse quickened as I carefully pulled it out. It was a map of the estate, with a specific location marked in red. The old garden, the place my grandfather had spent hours working on, even in his final years. The garden, of course, that was where everything had started. That was where the past and future truly met. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed the map, shoved it into my pocket, and hurried out of the study. The garden was at the back of the house, beyond the hedge maze, tucked away behind a tall stone wall that seemed to shield it from the rest of the world. As I made my way down the narrow path, the air felt thick with anticipation. Every step brought me closer to the answer. Every step brought me closer to exposing the truth. The garden gate loomed ahead, its iron bars old and rusted. I reached for the latch, but before I could open it, I froze. A figure stood on the other side of the gate, watching me. It was my father. The main character, who had spent years buried in anger and the pursuit of revenge, now stood at the precipice of his final act of justice. His motivation had evolved throughout the story. It was no longer about revenge, but about restoring balance, about making sure that those who had wronged him and his family paid for their actions. He had discovered a new sense of purpose, the drive to see justice done and the truth exposed. He had become more than a victim. He had become the instrument of change. The villains, once powerful, arrogant, and untouchable, now found themselves caught in a web of their own making. They had underestimated the main character, believing he was weak, broken, and easy to manipulate. But now, the world was watching as they crumbled under the weight of their lies and betrayals. The main character's allies, a small but determined group of friends and family, stood by him, their unwavering support a stark contrast to the isolation the antagonists had once enjoyed. They were no longer in control. They had lost everything. The hero's final move was calculated and cold. He had gathered evidence over the years, waiting for the right moment to strike. With the help of his closest allies, he exposed the villains in a public scandal that sent shockwaves through their business empire. What had once been a thriving company was now in ruins, its leaders disgraced, their names tarnished beyond repair. The antagonist who had wronged the hero was left in a courtroom, finally admitting to the financial and personal manipulations that had destroyed lives, including his own. The villains made critical errors, underestimating the main character, taking him for granted, and becoming careless with their actions. They thought they had won, that they had silenced him for good, but their arrogance led to their downfall. The main character felt a strange emptiness after the dust settled, a satisfaction that was almost hollow, as if justice alone was not enough to fill the void. But he knew deep down that he had done what needed to be done. The hero had finally freed himself from the past, shedding the weight of vengeance and bitterness that had held him captive for so long. He moved on, leaving the city behind, starting fresh in a new place, a new chapter of his life. He found peace in a quiet corner of the world, no longer burdened by the ghosts of the past. His life became simpler, but in that simplicity, he found meaning. He even met someone new, someone who could see him for who he truly was, not as a victim or a crusader for justice, but as a person worthy of love and happiness. The villains, however, were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. Their empire crumbled, their secrets were laid bare, and their families turned their backs on them. The public turned against them, once loyal employees now distancing themselves. They were outcasts, living in the shadows of their former glory. The main character's victory was complete, but it came at a cost. He had no desire to gloat. His victory was personal, and it was enough to know that he had finally set things right. As the final chapter closed, the main character stood by the window of his new home, looking out at the sunset, a faint smile crossing his face. He picked up his phone and glanced at the last message he had received from one of the villains, a message begging for forgiveness, for a second chance. He set the phone down, his eyes cold as he whispered to himself, "You had your chance, and you blew it." And with that, he walked away from the past, leaving the ghosts to haunt those who had created them.